Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy that you came today to our ÖFG Peaceful Change lecture series. And peace and the opposite has lots of different facets. And today we're going to look predominantly at the environment. So we're going to look at climate change, at energy security, insecurity, and so on. And I'm very happy that I can welcome next to me Dr. Zehetner. He's Deputy Head of Department of, I wrote down Humanitarian Aid, but you said
Humanitarian Affairs.
Humanitarian Affairs in the Federal Ministry for European and International Affairs. And he has a very interesting curriculum vitae. He did lots of things aside from being a very good diplomat. So he was Speaker of the World Wildlife Fund in Austria, amongst other things. And he is also writing. And this is his latest book. It's in German, Europa im Schwitzkasten, in den Stürmen von Klimakrise und Weltpolitik. This is a great title, actually, but very difficult to translate because of all the metaphors. Yeah? My attempt was it's something like Europe in sweaty headlock amidst the storms of climate crisis and world politics. And I think today's talk, to a considerable extent, is going to be based on the book. So then please join me in welcoming Dr. Zehetner for today's talk. And he's going to talk for about 30 minutes or so, and then we have ample time for questions and answers.
Thank you.
You have the word.
So, thank you, and good evening. Also, a warm welcome to everyone in the live stream. I'm really pleased to be here, and thanks to Markus for giving me this opportunity. For me, it's also a return to the Diplomatic Academy, as I had a lot of training courses as a young diplomat here. So, yeah, I'm glad to return. Also, when the years have passed, I realized on the way in. Yes, also as a disclaimer at the start, I'm here in my private capacity and not on behalf of the Austrian Foreign Ministry. And yes, you already mentioned it. The reason why I'm here is that I published this book last autumn, Europa im Schwitzkasten, in the Picus Verlag. Yes, which I would translate Europe in a headlock, which is like this, which tries to look at current affairs both through a climate and energy lens and the international relations lens. So it tries to adopt this double perspective. And yes, with the title Europe in a Headlock, the first thing it refers to is the impact of global heating in Europe, obviously. So our continent is no island of bliss, I would say. So when we look at the temperature increases, actually they're actually more pronounced in Europe than in other parts of the world. And the days when we illustrated the climate crisis or global heating with images of a stranded polar bear or images of Africa, I think they're truly over. And I guess I do not have to repeat it for this audience here, but the consequences of the climate crisis have also arrived in Europe. But this term, Europe in a headlock, also refers to something else, namely Europe's dependency, which have been really, I think, become even more apparent since Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, which has shown, I think, what we see now is Europe's dependence on Russian gas, Europe's dependence on China when it comes to raw materials and supply chains, and also Europe's dependence on the US when it comes to military security. So I think this has been known before, but this war in Ukraine has laid this bare. And that's why the idea to this book came to me, I think it was in spring 2022, when the IPCC, this is this intergovernmental panel on climate change, published its report. Yes, and it stated we are not on track on reaching our climate goals, and also urged states really to stop approving new gas and oil projects, as there's something like a global addiction on oil and gas. And at the same time, I think it was just a week later or so, Russia launched its war of aggression against Ukraine. And as we know, this war has different reasons, but I think it's evident or fair to say that it's largely financed by Russia's exports of oil and gas. So this book is about this connection, and also the task of Europe that comes with it, the task of, first of all, becoming independent of Russian gas, but more fundamentally, to become independent of all sources of fossil fuel, coal, oil and gas, in the long run. And the book also tries to explore this geopolitical tensions between the United States and China, and the difficult role for Europe between those two powers. So that's also this headlock, basically. And climate and energy technologies, in particular, have become a new arena in this global competition. With intense and sometimes aggressive struggles for raw materials, for supply chains, and also for talent. And for Europe, the challenge really is not to be left behind in this, what some call, emerging green Cold War. And it's often said we live in fast-changing time, but I think for the last month or so, this is really true. So for this evening, I try to present three statements or three theses that go beyond day-to-day politics, really. The first thesis is that the geopoliticization of energy, or the energy transition, really is a key trend that's about to stay with us, also in Europe. And I think this research on the geopolitics of energy, or of the energy transition, is relatively young. I think many of the assumptions that we have, they come from the era of a purely fossil-based energy system. And this often underestimates how little future developments might be guided by the past. And I think it's difficult to create visions of the future with this yesterday thinking. And I think the scale of the upcoming changes, they are simply too big. And I think it's clear that these cards will be reshuffled. And just as this process of the energy transition has its losers, there will also be winners. So how might this new energy map look like? I think as it stands today, I think it's fair to say that China will reap the greatest strategic benefits from the energy transition and further improve its international standing. I think although China is faced with this challenge of phasing out the world's greatest coal industry, it will also produce more energy itself, and thereby reducing its independence from Russia and also from the Middle East. But I think what is really more important is that China has already, by now, established itself as a leader in many technologies. And within a relatively short period, the country has managed to rise to the international forefront thanks to its technological expertise. And it's really dominating now solar panels, electric cars, battery storage system. Just to give you one figure, I think 80% of global investments in battery factories is in China. So I think the first phase in this energy transition is really dominated by China. At the same time, I think one should also not make the mistakes of transferring these dynamics of the oil dependence from Middle East and all these dynamics we know from the 70s and 80s one-to-one to this new dependency. I think there are some structural and fundamental differences, and I think also despite China's current leadership, I think these geopolitical levers it has, they work very differently. And if, for instance, China were to restrict its exports of solar panels in a similar way, I think, yes, it would slow down the energy transition also in Europe, but the lights here would not go out. I think, and also this geopolitical weapon would also only work once. And because thereafter, I think China's strong market position would hardly recover. and other regions would compensate for this lack of production sooner or later. Also, as another example, if China would restrict the batteries for electric cars, I think, yes, this would probably, the prices for electric cars would increase, but it would not really restrict the mobility of people in the West. I think, on the contrary, such measures would hardly be noticed. So I think in return, it would rather increase this already noticeable trend towards regionalization of supply chain, and this would receive further impetus. And all of this does not mean that China's dependence, our dependence on China on many products is not a concern for Europe, but I think it just means that these geopolitical implications, they're really less straightforward than they often portrayed. And I think all too often it's also ignored that these renewable energies are much more decentralized and evenly distributed across the world. And I think this makes it unlikely in the medium to long term that a few states will dominate the market, as was the case in the past. And that's why I also believe that Europe has the potential to be among the geopolitical winners in this transition, as it can become much more autonomous. And its energy expenditures will be cheaper in the medium term than today's bill. I think European countries will be able to enhance their energy security. And as currently, I think it's around 3/4 of the overall energy consumption in Europe is met by fossil fuels, and 60% of this is imported. So I think this really means that the decarbonization of our energy system really is the only structural way to reduce our energy costs and also to increase our energy security, really. I think until very recently, I would have also counted the United States among the winners of the energy transition. Yes, it is the biggest oil exporters by now and also has a huge LNG industry. But I think due to its very dynamic economy and its research sector, I think the US has every chance to be at the forefront of these technological developments. I think this has obviously changed now. I think we can perhaps discuss it later on, what the repercussions of this policy shift will be. A clear loser, in my view, will be Russia as the currently largest gas exporter and the second largest oil exporter. Also, the Russian state budget is extremely dependent on oil and gas. It has a very strong fossil fuel lobby within the state, which makes it very hard to diversify. And while it's also a relatively low-cost producer, large parts of its infrastructure are outdated in investment, which is also difficult due to the current sanction regime. So this was already, that's why there are comparisons to the so-called Kodak moment, which is a reference to Kodak, which was the market leader at the beginning of I think, 2003, and then said digital photography is a niche product and soon went bankrupt only a few years later. I think at the same time, I think determining the winners and losers of the energy transition is not as simple as it may seem. Everything you know about the geopolitical impacts of the climate crisis is wrong, says the US energy expert and former Obama advisor Jason Bordoff. And I think especially when we talk about oil-producing countries, I think it's interesting to say that after this peak oil demand, I think there will be a fierce competition among oil-producing countries. But who is it's called the last man standing. But this paradoxically would also mean that especially the Gulf states have the best starting position as they're very capable of efficient production, and that it's rather likely in the next decade that their market share will increase and thus also their influence. So what else will change during the energy transition? I think when we look at fossil fuels from an economic perspective, this high concentration of existing reserves makes it very likely to trigger geopolitical shocks. Oil price was to a large extent, or is, determined by decisions of OPEC, and I think it was precisely this dependence on fossil fuels that led the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, after the shock of the Russian war, to call renewables as the peace plan of the 21st century. And I think when you look at the slowly emerging world map of renewable energies and contrast it with the map of fossil fuels, I think these differences between the old and new become pretty clear. I think the map of fossil fuels is characterized by high geographical concentration, enormous cross-border flows and high profits for everybody involved. So you look at the map and you see the wealth of Gulf states, you see Russia's gas or the black gold of Texas. And if you contrast it with this new map, as I call it, of renewables, it doesn't show any region where wind, sun, or hydropower are similarly concentrated. I think they are found almost anywhere. It can be a solar panel next to a supermarket or a wind farm next to an industrial park. So I think this is really a fundamental distinction between those two forms of energy. And I think this better availability of renewables makes it a more democratic form of energy. And I think we all now also in looking out always for positive trends. And I think it's fair to say that this transition to renewable energy can have, in the end, positive effects on international relations. And I would claim that it's indeed plausible that a green future could be more peaceful than the past. However, we are now in a transition phase, and this is always with challenges. And I think what we see now is that this future energy landscape will coexist with this old map for several decades. And I think what history can teach us is that these transition phases are not only seen as opportunities, but also as threats by those who stand to lose. And such times, they are rarely characterized by order and stability. So I think what we see now is that this global energy transition, it will not only bring an end to the struggle for power and influence, but rather lead to a fundamental transformation. And I think in this era of energy insecurity that we are in now, all states will attempt to gain political and economic advantages, which means that these geopolitical risks, they are real. However, I would claim that they are not a reason to slow down the transition or to put it on hold. Quite the opposite. These risks are relatively small to the consequences of unchecked global heating. And I think there a far greater danger is that this transition really happens too slowly. I would now like to zoom into Europe. And my second thesis would be that this European Green Deal must go global. So what do I mean? The European Green Deal, as you might know, it has been launched by the European Commission in 2019. It was very much under this influence of Fridays for Future. Hundreds of thousands of people went onto the streets. Climate change was on everybody's lips. And this European Green Deal really offered this chance to establish a new political project for the European Union. So you had this omnipresent crisis sound within Europe, and this was really seen as an opportunity also, first of all, to recognize this existential nature of climate change, but then also really for the European Union to reinvent itself. Its centerpiece is the so-called Fit for 55 package, with the goal of reducing CO2 emissions by 55% until this decade, the end of this decade, and to achieve climate neutrality as a first continent in the world by the middle of the century. And this generated a huge wave of legislation, boosting renewable energy targets, energy efficiency, reforming of the emissions trading scheme, really a lot happened. Some of it successful, some of it watered down or taken back. But I would say overall, it deserves more credit than it gets, at least in public. But what was really missing, in my opinion, was this global perspective of the European Green Deal. I think it was very much inward-looking. It was very much about what Europe can do within its borders, which is important because Europe has to do its homework and also try to lead by example. But we also should not forget that Europe is currently responsible for around 7% of global CO2 emissions, and the trend is even going towards 5% in a few years. So the rest of the world must participate, otherwise it's not working. And it's pointless for the EU to become a green island in a brown world, let's put it like this. And what I think is that the EU really underestimates the international repercussions of its climate and energy policy. And I have two examples for this. The first one is this so-called CBAM. I don't know how much you are, it's this typical Brussels acronym for the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is basically a climate tariff. And the idea behind it is that if Europe enforces strict climate policies, while other parts of the world do not, there's a high risk that energy-intensive companies will leave the European Union due to higher CO2 prices. And companies would relocate their operations to places with lower CO2 prices, carbon leakage, as it's called. And this EU climate tariff aims to counteract it, and it's used for sectors such as cement, steel, aluminium, hydrogen, and the amount of the tax really depends on the CO2 content of these imported products. So to prohibit that basically green steel from Europe is disadvantaged, has a disadvantage compared to dirty imported steel. And the second goal it's pursuing is what is called this Brussels effect, that it tries to provide an incentive for other countries to introduce their own carbon prices, and basically to persuade other countries to introduce comparable climate policy and instigate a race to the top. So that's the idea behind it. The question really is it going to work? Will it succeed? And I think one of the main problems with this, as it's on the table right now, is that many of the poorest countries and most climate-affected countries in the global south are also concerned by this, about these economic consequences. According to one study from the LSE, Africa as a whole continent could lose up to $25 billion per year as a result of this climate tariff. So I think and one should not forget that especially these developing countries, that their contribution to climate change are relatively little. So I think until this climate tariff are actually introduced, I think there's still time to take this criticism more seriously and develop a better approach to greening the trade flows with the global south. And I think one also risks, especially also with this, I mean, China does not like it, the US does not like it. One obviously risks in this climate as it is at the moment to even deepen the trade wars in the next year or two. So I think it will need a lot of diplomacy and a lot of internal and external coordination within the European Union to avoid these consequences. And the second point where I think that the EU needs much more foreign policy thinking in its climate policy is that it needs much stronger and effective partnerships in the energy sector. I think it really needs a push in the next years to secure the supply of raw materials and renewables from across the world, basically. And I think only with such partnerships up the supply chain, it can also help from the mere extraction also to refining and value-added processes. And I think this is especially true for Europe's immediate neighborhood, which is marked by the so-called Ring of Fire, so which is a region with many fragile states that risk becoming the losers of this energy transition. And many of these countries rely heavily on energy exports to Europe. So I think therefore the EU has a responsibility to support them in their transition. I think it is especially about the stability of countries such as Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia. They have also significant potential for renewables and also for the production of green hydrogen. The European Union has also launched this Global Gateway strategy, which is basically a European response to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, where it's also mobilizing 300 billion euros. And I think this also should be used much more strategically for raw material partnerships, which will be needed in the coming years. So I will argue that in the next years, the European Green Deal's external dimension will gradually become as important as its internal dimension. And this can only succeed if the EU combines the power and resources of its classical diplomacy with the financial means of the European energy and industrial policy. So I think this is really the task for the next 5 years and this new institutional cycle for the Green Deal to go global. My third and final thesis would be that also for Europe, the energy transition is an agenda of opportunities. I think we have seen indeed a backlash in the last year or two. There's a lot of criticism about climate change. It's seen about climate policies. It's seen by many as a being dictated by elites. But I think whenever the energy transition has been successful, it has also served as a means to create new jobs, new industries, and geopolitical power. So I think even for those who are not very much concerned about climate change as such, I think they must recognize the strategic and the strategic arguments in favor of decarbonization and really realize the economic opportunities it presents. I think the European Commission has understood this. It has said time and again, we stay the course, and we will put forward a clean industrial deal, basically to marry decarbonization and industrial competitiveness, which is very much under threat in Europe at the moment. I think this clean deal, it was presented today. I didn't have time yet to analyze it, but I think what is interesting about it is the fact that such an industrial strategy is needed is really an acknowledgement of the European Union that the world has changed rapidly in the recent years, and that China now has a significant lead in many technologies, and that Europe cannot exist in a bubble, and that it needs to respond, and that Europe's pace simply has not been fast enough. Because I think Europe's fear of deindustrialization has been aroused, and I think until a few years ago, this term industrial policy was still a kind of curse word in Brussels. Everything revolved around market liberalization. And I think what we have seen in the last years is really a departure from these old paradigms. And I think the reason for this change was the realization that Europe must respond to the strategic competition between the US and China. I think this new balance between protectionism and free trade and interventionism and liberalism still needs to be found, but it's clear, I think, that this industrial policy is no longer a taboo, because I think if it does not happen, then this European energy transition will be made in China, could be labeled as made in China. But what is needed, therefore, really is an increase in investments in green technologies. I think it's not enough to wait here for a couple of years until the next European budget cycle. I think we need this financial firepower already now. I think it's an important investment in the future. And I think the costs of inaction place a far greater burden on the budget as these losses from climate change continue to rise. And I think although the EU admittedly still has a lot of foreign and security policy shortcomings, I think when it comes to economic policy and technological policy, I think it still has a role to play. And I think there's ample of room for a strong European role in this global climate and energy transition. And I think this is especially true in the light of the policies of the new US administration. I'm really convinced that the transformation of the economy is not going to stop. These green technologies, they offer a lot of opportunities. They're becoming cheaper and more competitive. And I think these trends or these market forces, they are stronger than any US president. And I think the rest of the world is not going to stand still. The investments in China are massive. They are not going to stop. And I think they will be thrilled if the US administration kills their own green economy. And I think this is also, there are studies who say that US policies, recent policies, could create up to $80 billion in investment opportunity for other countries as these global markets shares shift. And I think this should also be seen as a stimulus for the EU. And I think in recent years, the EU was always very worried that all the investments go to the US. So I think this shift now in the new administration also could reopen the door for increased investments within Europe. So I think if you look for some for some positive news among the current doom and gloom, here it is. So basically to conclude, as I pointed out, I think it's challenging to implement the European Green Deal while at the same time having to deal with the international repercussions, having to deal with increased geopolitical tensions and the pressure on its own competitiveness. But nevertheless, this transition in Europe has already begun. I think we are in the process of rebuilding our economy while at open sea. And I think we can also expect these seas to become even rougher. And I think with the European Green Deal, we do have a European response to this most pressing issue of our time. And this really goes far beyond climate policy. It affects all parts of society, from finance, technology, industry, the economy, and also, of course, also foreign and security policy. And I think Europe's future prosperity will, to a large extent, depend on the successful implementation. And I think this also means that, in my opinion, the central question no longer is whether this climate and energy transition will happen, but rather how quickly it will happen. Will it proceed at a slow pace and therefore being too late? Or will it happen fast enough by the middle of the century? And this shift in perspective, I think, also applies to Europe. And I think the question now also for Europe is, who will take the lead in this global race for change? Who will benefit the most from this technological, economic, and also social changes? And will Europe be among those who act swiftly and unleash a kind of momentum? Or will it lag behind and have to adopt the rules who are formulated elsewhere? So for Europe too, the question or the success is not only determined whether the transition happens, but also how quickly it will happen. Thank you.
Thomas, thank you very, very much. Maybe sit down here again, and then we have time now for questions and answers. I think it was a very lucid talk, 3 key arguments, and so anyone who wants to go for it. Experience tells that they are quite active, so I'm always going to bundle 3 questions, and then I'm going to give you the word. And we're going to make things easy for you, so start in the back. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Luca Fetta, a student here at the DA. And you talked a lot about the geopolitical competition for energy transition, about the winners and losers, China and the US. And I think, well, there is an argument to be made about the implications of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US or environmental authoritarianism in China and how they inhibit European leadership. I think ultimately the largest enemy of European leadership in energy transition is domestic. And with the recent elections that we've seen in Germany and Austria or on the European level, climate change doesn't really play a role anymore. We see the vilification of modern technology of heat pumps or PVs. And these measures that you've talked about from the European level, CBAM, which I would argue is sneaky protectionism for the internalization of carbon emissions from even developing countries, or green hydrogen productions, these are easy measures. And if we look at the latest IPCC reports, I think it's illusionary to assume that we can get away with decarbonization without hard decisions. And so my question to you is, how do we reconcile this lack of democratic legitimacy for climate change policy and this growing need for it on a European level?
Thank you. My name is Adriana from ETIA program. And you talk about the percentage of emissions of Europe. So I came up with these questions. Do you think that the outsourcing of pollution has been accounted for the percentage of emission that Europe officially reports, or is a strategy between Europe transition to appear more eco-friendly?
I'm not quite. Could you rephrase it? Or
Yeah, you mentioned about the percentage of the emissions of Europe. So my question is, this our report is a strategy of Europe to look more eco-friendly, or they are accounting the outsourcing of emissions? For example, Zara, H&M, all these fast fashion that are producing contamination in countries like Latin America, India, Africa, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, my name is Kylie Johnson. I'm a student here as well. My question was, you mentioned that China will lead in reaping the benefits in the initial energy transition. Do you foresee a potential increased European reliance on Chinese energy exports as a perhaps swap for Russian energy dependence? And especially as the US and EU relationship tends to be weakening with the Trump administration?
Thank you. And then Thomas, you have the word. That was the first three.
No, I was expecting a difficult question, and here I am. How can we? I mean, the first question about how can we foster democratic support? I mean, this is obviously something also that keeps me up at night, and of course the results of the elections also in Austria, but more general, this is not encouraging. This is clear. I think my approach would be really to formulate, to take a bit of a broader perspective. And when we talk about what needs to be done and how we have to change our economic model, not simply to talk about climate change, not phrase it that much in moral terms. I think we talk too much in moral terms in the past. I think this is not really working. And try to rephrase it and really say that this is about mobility, this is about different industry, how to increase the competitiveness of our industry. This is about foreign policy. And thereby try to change the discussion. I think what is also important, that would be my second response to this, is not to forget the social dimension of climate change. I think this is something that probably has been neglected, or only kind of first the climate policies have been devised, and only afterwards we looked at the social implication. I think this is also something, also at the European level, very often some lip service to the social dimension is made, but I think it's not really incorporated, and it's not sufficiently also in the mindset of policymakers. I think that That's one response, and the other one is also perhaps, I mean, we have always ups and downs, and I was surprised in, when was it, 2019, 2020, that there was such a big momentum. So one can only hope that this is part of this natural cycle as well. About the outsourcing being not counted. I mean, the figure I gave you, the 7%, this really refers to the European production. So this means to the extent that Europe imports goods from China, or I don't know, textile from Bangladesh or wherever, this is not counted. So of course this also then distorts the statistics. So there are different ways to calculate the CO2 per capita, and if you take a model where one counts what an average European consumes on CO2, of course it would be much higher. And the third question is, yes, I mean about Russia and the relationship with China. I mean, with Russia, I think the European Union is quite, I mean, it's quite established now in all the documents that we are going to phase out the imports of Russian gas. I think this has already significantly decreased in the last year at the European level. For Austria, the numbers are a bit different, but I still think that there's a strong commitment, and even now with this, I don't know, talks about between the US and Russia, I don't see a return to this old model of us, even if there are some voices from the industry from time to time who would who would want to go back. I think this era of cheap Russian gas for the European industry, I think they are truly over. And I think everybody in Europe has to accept that. And this, of course, means that more Russian gas is going to China. What we also see is that, of course, we have record levels now of LNG from the US going to Europe. So it's a bit a lot of shifts in the energy landscapes going on.
Thomas, thank you. Then we can move on to the next batch of three. Perhaps let's make it easy. Start with the ambassador in the front, and then we can move over there.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Majd Mufaddal. I'm the ambassador of Sudan. Now, I have a couple of questions. The first one is, how do you see the energy policy of the new American administration on its impact on the energy transition here in Europe? He has this slogan of drill, baby, drill. How is it going to impact the energy transition here in Europe? Is it going to be more exports of LNG to Europe? This is the first one. The second is, how do you see the role of nuclear energy in the energy transition? Because now we are seeing a lot of developments in the field of energy, and nuclear energy for the last COPs, it has been adopted as one of the energies that are going to contribute to energy transition, and it is not being looked as in the past. And also we have new developments like the SMR technology, which is expected also to bring like some sort of a revolution in the energy, in the nuclear energy. How do you see its impact on the energy transition? The third one is, how do you see the issue of critical minerals in the Europe's energy transition? Because also it is also a very important factor in the issue of Europe's competitiveness, because it is one of the challenges, the biggest challenge that are facing Europe's economy. As in Draghi's report, Mario Draghi's report, it was the issue of competitiveness. So how is Europe going to address this issue of critical minerals with its all geopolitical and dimensions? And now with the expected peace deal in Ukraine, don't you think that and with the rise of the right in Europe, there will not be, don't we think that a lot of new voices are going to say, let us go back, since now we have a peace agreement or a peace in Ukraine, let us go back to the cheap Russian gas. Thank you.
Excellent questions. Thank you very much. And then, yeah.
Oopsie. Thank you very much. My name is Ines. I'm a MICE2 student here at the DA. And my question would be, I absolutely see the positive effects, even more like midterm, long-term of energy transition. I'm just like wondering, because short-term, I imagine with all the investments and changes that are necessary, that also for the consumers, the prices will rise like short-term. I know there will be benefits then in the end and in the future, but I'm kind of worried that when consumers see these rising prices, they will of course not be convinced because they see the immediate effects and don't think of the long-term effects, and that, I don't know how to kind of counterbalance it or outbalance that. I don't know if that is like also part of your book. Because I also see, like Lucas mentioned before, the danger that might kind of lead to more popularization or more radicalization when it comes to politics, and then there might be governments that are even less in favor of this kind of transitions, like we can see now. Maybe you can just like go a bit more into the social dimensions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think Florian, you had a hand up. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Florian. I'm also a student here at the Academy. So you emphasized a lot the advantages of the energy transition to the energy security. You partly mentioned that already, but do you think this might create a serious problem for Europe's economic competitiveness, especially in the short run? Thank you.
Thank you. Thomas, your turn.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador, for the questions also. Drill, baby, drill. My first response would be breathe, baby, breathe, I think. I mean, of course, it is concerning what we see in the US, and also leaving the Paris Agreement is, of course, is a major setback for international climate diplomacy. But as I tried to point out in my presentation also, I think for Europe, this can also present some economic opportunities and to get some investment. I mean, I'm still not completely sure where the US policies would go, where they will go. I also would not, I think in the end, I think they do not care that much about which source of energy it is. I think it's mainly the preoccupation about dominance, really. So I wouldn't be surprised if they adopt a renewable energy bill or a climate, and then it has just a different name, and it's called the free energy bill or something like that. So I think it's a bit too early to tell, but I think what is sure is this pressure to buy more American LNG. I think this might increase. But I think what is important now for Europe is really to stay the course and continue, and try to also to make to offer this stable regulatory framework, which it has. I think which is also important for companies, and which is a bit more questionable now in the United States. When it comes to nuclear energy, I mean, Austria has a very clear position here. We famously we constructed a nuclear plant. I don't know if you're aware, and then we never put it into use. Also on a global level, I think there's just not a good economic case for nuclear energy. I mean, I know that, but I think by now, I think it's well established that renewables are the cheapest form of energy. I mean, I understand as a base load, I think it makes sense, and there's room for it also in Europe. But I don't see, I mean, I'm hearing the stories about the renaissance of nuclear energy for years, but the figures don't really show. So I think it's really constant, and it's not really picking up significantly. So I don't think this is the future. I don't see an increase in market share for nuclear energy. When it comes to critical materials, raw materials, yes, this is already pointed out, this dependence we have on China. I think it's dominating a lot of those supply chains. I think the European Union is aware of this. It adopted this Critical Raw Materials Act, as it's called, where it really tries to foster also the production of, and I think in Europe there are a lot of sites with very promising sites with a lot of critical raw materials. I think it's often a problem also with the permitting and public acceptance. This is not that easy. And I think we should also not underestimate the pace of technological innovation in that sector. I think there's really a lot of research being done, and I wouldn't be surprised that what is now this needed, like lithium for batteries of electric car, that this can be supplemented, and especially when it comes to circular economy. Europe is in a very good market position. Already today, when this clean industrial deal was presented, there was a strong focus on recycling and on reusing these materials. If that's enough, I'm not sure, but I think there are a lot of efforts undertaken in this direction. Peace agreement with Ukraine. Well, last time I checked, there was none yet. So I think we still have to. I think this is all very much in flux. I think it's very hard to make any forecasts of. I think it's worrying that I think, of course, Ukraine has to be on the table. Europe has to be on the table when we talk about the future of Ukraine. What this really means for Russian gas flowing back, picking up again, I don't really see it coming. I think there's a lot of resistance, especially from Eastern European countries. Already, like 10 years ago, when we had this discussion within Europe on Nord Stream 2, there was a lot of resistance within Europe, and there is an established track record of Russia of using their gas transport to Europe. I think there are like hundreds of cases going back really since the 80s, where Russia used its natural gas as a weapon. And even if there would be some sort of agreement, I don't know, this is not going to stop. So I think we really have to be very careful to go back to this old way of thinking. And I think this is more nostalgia than a serious way forward. The next question was the rising prices. I think we should not forget, because sometimes it's portrayed also in the media, that this rising prices of energy, that they are due to too much regulation, or they blame the European Green Deal. I think the single biggest explanation for higher prices are that the Russian gas has really extremely increased since the price has extremely increased since the spring of 2022. And I think that's the reason, and we had to use enormous aid packages, billions of euros that have been had to be used to stabilize the prices. That's also then the reason for our budget deficit, also in Austria. And as I tried to explain, I only see the only structural way I see for Europe to be more energy, to increase the energy security, is to really invest in renewables here, but also in form of partnerships with countries in our neighborhood. And for the medium term, I think that's what Europe does, and this also makes sense, is to diversify, to make new gas agreements, what we did with Norway, with the US, Azerbaijan. I think this makes sense, but I think one should be careful not to lock ourselves in very long-term contracts. I think that's the danger of it. If we want to fulfill this goal of becoming climate neutral by 2050, of course this does not work if you have contracts for 20, 30 years or so, or even longer. Yes, I think that was pretty much the questions.
Thank you, and then we can do one more round. So then I have 3 hands up, so that's very easy. Let's start over there.
Hello, my name is Julia Monti. I'm also a student here at the DA. And you mentioned that diplomacy is an important tool for this time and in the future of energy. And so I was wondering, how can European climate diplomacy navigate the tension between national energy interests and the need for a unified EU, but also global strategy? And as the shift towards renewable energy reshapes international relations, do you think the current global institutions like the UN, the EU, the WTO are capable of handling this transformation, or do we need to form like new international corporations?
Hello, thank you for your insightful talk. My name is Karina Jagersberger. I'm also a student here at the DA. And I was wondering what your view is on the role of nuclear energy on Europe's path towards energy independence and a renewable energy system. Now, I mean, Austria has quite a clear stance on that, but now Germany turning away slowly from nuclear energy, France wanting to invest there. How do you see that for Europe as the European Union? Thank you.
Thank you. And last question, Ismail.
Thank you. My name is Ismail, and I'm also a student here at the DA. And my question was about the timelines. I mean, you mentioned that in the immediate, in the near future, yes, it's going to cause certain pain, but in the long-term perspective, the Green Deal is a good thing. But my question is, Europe's now as I see Europe, in a very difficult position in terms of aging and dying population, which means higher social burden. That's first. Second, the pressure from Trump administration regarding military expenses. Trump demands Europe to have 5% GDP for military purpose only. That's to free, if Europe participates as a peacekeeper in a deal, in the peace deal with Ukraine. I read somewhere the estimations were that Europe would be in a position that around 300 billion euros per year should be allocated to support the troops, the peacekeeping forces, which might be deployed in Ukraine. And the question is, like you said, yeah, in long term it's going to be fine, it's going to be good, but the question is whether it's going to be possible in the near future in general. French budget is, if I'm mistaken, 5% deficit, which is higher than average norm in the EU. And Germany also struggles with budget. And there are also other let's say, expenditures, again, social expenditures, military expenditures. And the question is like where to get money and whether this transition in general is possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you. Regarding the question on diplomacy, I mean, what was striking for me when I was at the first time at the COPs, at this UN climate conference, is that you have so many climate experts there with very little understanding, I would say, of international relations, and you have a few diplomats there with a rather superficial understanding of climate change. So what I saw as really missing there is a lot of people who are into both, who are experts on both. I think that's really sometimes lacking in this discussion, who are, especially at these COPs, who are super complex and where it's only about the agenda and who gets what. I think there's often a lack of this geopolitical understanding at play. But I'm still convinced that this UN process, the UNFCCC, it's not sufficient, but it's a very important forum. I think there's no other way, no other forum where all states come together. I mean, as it is always within UN processes, the final results, there are compromises. It's never enough. But I think it would be difficult to delegitimize it as a forum, because I wouldn't see what else could substitute it. And I think it's only in my experience, the only place where also a lot of countries from the global south or Pacific states, where they're really at an equal footing there, and for them it's really a very, very important forum to make the voices heard, and especially also to address questions of climate justice, which are often overlooked. And I think this is also a task for Europe, as now more or less the only defender of this multilateral order. I think it really has to step up there, and this is probably only works with a big checkbook. But I think that's really also in its own interests there to defend these multilateral institutions. Yes, nuclear energy, I already talked about it a bit before. I mean, you really do have this split within Europe, and we have this group of renewables, Friends of Renewables as they are called. They are led by Austria. I think it's around a dozen countries, and then you also have around a dozen countries who are more prone to nuclear energy. I think this is going to coexist for the foreseeable future. I don't see any changes. This is still up to the sovereignty, it's the decision of every single country, which energy mix it wants to follow, and also the EU institutions have understood this. And I think, of course, for France, I mean, the Austrian position is clear, but of course for France it wouldn't make sense now to switch off the nuclear power station. That's also clear. So I think this is going to coexist, and I think the main goal must be, and that must be the common goal, must be the goal of decarbonization, really. Yeah. And the last questions. You mentioned Ukraine also. I mean, what also this point I want to make about Ukraine is that it also, when we then slowly move, I'm also talking to Austrian companies, they are quite interested also in going to Ukraine and to invest there. So this is already starting, and I think this is also really a case there. It has for this as a business case also for this green transition. I think especially, I mean, now we talk a lot about this rare earth of Ukraine and who gets them, and I think they're already sold like twice or three times. But I think also when it comes to green hydrogen or renewables, Ukraine offers a lot of opportunity also for the rest of Europe, also on the way to enlargement for Austrian company. So, and when it comes to the budget, I think this will be one of the most difficult decisions. I think this spring, the European Commission will make the first proposal for the next 7-year multi-annual framework, which is basically this European budget. And this is always very complicated and disputed, but I think this time it will be truly disputed, and I think it's all the countries face face high budget deficits. We have increased demands on military spending, and of course we also have to finance the green transition. So I think it will be important to, I don't know, square this circle really, and that will be something to watch closely in the next years.
On that note, let me get out. You can deal with things bilaterally. Is okay? Yeah. On that note, Thomas, thank you very, very much.
You're welcome.
Join me in a round of applause. And please come by again, okay? Latest when you publish your next book.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I just want to say that. Well, first I want to say I think also as a student, I think this is a very promising and rich field to look at this all the geopolitical implications of climate change and energy. It has so many different aspects. I think this is really something which is very enriching, I think. And the second thing is that you can, if you're interested, this book is also available over there at the table. Thank you.
Thank you.